Officers searched the area surrounding the vehicle, and in the early hours of what was by then Christmas Eve, at about 2:15 a.m, they found Paul's body. It was lying in the snow, around 50 yards from his car. If you grew up around Consett in the early 90s, there's a good chance you've heard the name Paul Logan. He was one of those everyday, run-of-the-mill blokes just living his best life. Aged just 25, Paul lived in the Black Hill area of Consett with his wife Pamela and his 2 children. Michael, his eldest, was aged either 3 or 4 during our main timeline, and Natalie, the youngest, his daughter, was still a baby. She wasn't even 1 yet. By all accounts, Paul absolutely adored his family. His son was even said to have been his little shadow, following him everywhere he went, and no doubt idolising the main paternal figure in his life. Paul had been with Pamela for nearly a decade at the point of our main timeline, and his family said he was a devoted husband and dad. He absolutely doted on his kids especially. His mum Elsie described him as loving. Not perfect by any stretch, but who is, right? His sister Dawn remembered growing up with him fondly, saying they'd had brilliant times together. And his brother, Hugh Jr., said Paul was a good brother, a good son and father who'd do anything for the people he cared about. He was well known locally around Shotley Bridge and Black Hill, and not just because of his friendly, happy-go-lucky demeanour. Rather, it was because he worked as a delivery driver for the Golden Flower, a Chinese restaurant/takeaway located in the heart of Shotley Bridge. He'd been working there most evenings for about 2 years, which meant plenty of people saw him coming and going, out and about doing his rounds, especially the locals that got their meals delivered by him. Now, it's important to mention, and Paul's own family were open about this, he was no angel. Both his mum and brother said as much. Like anyone else does, he'd fallen out with many people over the years. There were rumours going round that he was a bit of a Jack the Lad type, maybe even a so-called hard man around Consett. But whether that was true or just hearsay is hard to confirm, especially as an outsider. Detectives at the time didn't comment on those claims, and the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, between how his friends and family saw him and how the gossip painted him. What we do know is that in the couple of months before his death, Paul had been having a rough time. Something he could really have done without, given Christmas was on the horizon. Natalie's first Christmas, no less. His car was vandalised on 3 separate occasions. And on one of those times, someone even scratched the words, "no legs," on the vehicle. Now, there's a bit of a debate about what those words exactly mean when they were scratched onto the roof. Some online speculators suggest it could be anything from a direct threat to a drug-related vendetta. Officially, it's never been confirmed what that threat meant, if it was a threat. The police were aware of those incidents, meaning Paul was on their radar, and it led to talk that he might have had a few enemies in his life. Apparently, he was so fed up with it all that he even offered a mate of his £500. It's about £1,000 in today's money, to find out who was behind the repeated vandalism. So, while his family remember him as a kind, hard-working dad who'd help anyone, it's fair to say Paul's life had its share of complications. Like so many of us, he had his ups and downs, his friends and his foes. And some of the things that went on in those last few months are still surrounded by rumour. I can't say where the truth ends and speculation begins, or vice versa. I never knew Paul, or his family personally. But one thing's certain, whatever his flaws or reputation were, nothing justifies what happened to him one fateful winter night. In the evening of December 23rd, 1993, just 2 days before Christmas, Paul was out doing what he always did most evenings, delivering meals to customers for the Golden Flower. It was a busy time of year. Christmas always is. People were getting ready for the holidays. And Paul was working hard to get through the night's many orders. The person on the line wanted to place an order, with the delivery address being Blue House Farm, which sat right near the boundary between County Durham and Northumbria. The thing is, the caller didn't make much sense to the staff member who answered the phone. Now, it's unclear whether this was due to the instructions themselves or whether it was perhaps an accent barrier. The caller gave vague directions that even the owner of the restaurant, a man called Tony, couldn't really follow. The caller was quickly told that the delivery driver, Paul in this case, would have to ring him back to get clearer instructions. About 20 minutes later, Paul did exactly that. He called the number back, got the directions, and headed out to Blue House Farm. He sort of had an idea where the place was, and it wasn't far. About a mile away, a 5-minute or so drive. It was just another delivery as far as Paul was concerned. Nothing out of the ordinary. Or so it seemed. When Paul got to the incredibly isolated farmhouse at around 9:50 p.m, the whole thing turned out to be a hoax. Whoever had called didn't actually want food, and the owners were not expecting visitors. Paul was told nobody at the house had made a food order, and so he went back to his car in a state of confusion and headed off down the single narrow path leading back to Pike Hill, the nearest main road. Now, I can't stress just how isolated Blue House Farm is. It's basically in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a plethora of fields and woodland. Its remoteness would later be seen as the reason Paul was led there by his killers. Getting back to the story, before Paul could leave the farm, he had to get out of the car again, because the gate that led to the access road had been closed despite it being open when he arrived. The farm's owners would later say they'd left the gate open that night. So the only logical explanation was that someone must have closed it after Paul arrived. That little detail would later become one of the eeriest parts of this story. Not long after, the people who lived at the farm noticed something strange. Paul's car, a white or cream-coloured Peugeot with the registration D340EFS, was still parked at the end of their lane with its lights on. But there was no sign of movement. At around 10:20 p.m, they phoned the Golden Flower to ask why their driver was still there. Tony, the owner, said he didn't know. And after that, he called Pamela, asking if Paul had come home yet. He hadn't. Pamela then started to panic. It wasn't like Paul not to come straight back from a delivery. He even had this little tradition whenever he was nearly home. He'd toot the horn as he drove past the house, a sort of I'm done for the night signal to let Pamela and the kids know he'd be home soon. That night, there was no horn. Pamela rang Paul's mum, Elsie, who said she hadn't seen him either. Knowing something were wrong, Paul's dad, Hugh, went to the Chinese takeaway to talk to Tony, and before long, the men were on their way to Blue House Farm where Paul's car was. When they got there, their worst fears started to form. The car doors were wide open. The lights were still on, but Paul was nowhere to be seen. The police were called not long after by the homeowners. Officers searched the area surrounding the vehicle, and in the early hours of what was by then Christmas Eve, at about 2:15 a.m, they found Paul's body. It was lying in the snow, around 50 yards from his car. It quickly became clear this wasn't simply a robbery case gone wrong. Paul's money was still on him. He had cash in his pockets, and the car hadn't been stolen or even ransacked. Whoever killed Paul wasn't after his belongings. They were after him. Police later said he'd been bludgeoned to death, suffering severe head injuries in the process, something the post-mortem confirmed. The pathologist, a man called John McCarthy, revealed at the inquest that Paul had been struck around 10 times to the head and upper body with what was likely a long, round rod. In total, his body showed 27 separate wounds, and some of those were defensive, signs that Paul had tried to protect himself. The force of the blows was horrific. His skull was fractured, and he'd suffered extensive brain damage. The 3 head wounds alone were enough to kill him. The official verdict was unlawful killing. From what investigators could tell, Paul had tried to run from whoever attacked him, which is why his body was found a short distance from the car. The murder weapon, though, has never been found. The hunt for Paul Logan's killer, or killers, was led by Detective Superintendent David Wilson. And from the start, it was clear this wasn't going to be a straightforward case. Around 50 officers were assigned to it, tasked with knocking on doors, interviewing neighbours, and combing through every lead they could find. But they ran into problems almost immediately. People in the local community were reluctant to talk to them. Reporters found much the same thing. And DS Wilson even expressed his disappointment, saying it was like there was a code of silence being followed. As Christmas approached in the northeast of England, there were heavy snow showers across the region. Fresh snowfall quickly covered the ground, making it difficult to search the fields properly for evidence. But despite those setbacks, detectives were fairly sure about one thing early on. Whoever killed Paul knew the area well. This wasn't a random attack committed by a stranger. It didn't offer much comfort to the locals, but it was something to hang on to. They also believed it had been planned and carried out by more than one person. I mean, think about it. Someone made a call from a public phone box. Then they waited in it for 20 minutes for Paul to call them back. Then they somehow got to Blue House Farm before or shortly after Paul arrived. That takes organisation and some insane local knowledge. The fact that, assuming this was a targeted attack, they got Paul to make that delivery is astounding all of itself. A young couple did come forward saying they'd seen someone in a phone box around the time of that call, and a red Ford Fiesta XR2 was parked nearby. That was between 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. The man in the phone box was trying not to draw attention to himself and wasn't actually on the phone when the couple first walked past. But he was when they turned round and saw him as they walked away. That likely coincided with Paul calling him back. They described him as white, about 6 foot tall, around 30 years old with a muscular build, with dark collar-length hair that was receding at the front and wearing a black leather jacket. The driver of the Fiesta looked similar, scruffy, dark-haired, also donning a black leather jacket. Another sighting on that fateful night added to the mystery. A red or orange Astra was spotted about 150 yards from the farm, and police appealed for the people in that car to come forward. In January 1994, Paul's parents put up a £10,000 reward, that's just over $21,000 in today's money, for information leading to a conviction. 4 men were said to be helping police with their inquiries in that first week of January, and 5 in total had been questioned. But 1 was released early on, and the rest were later. Detectives also started to believe Paul's killers had been following him in the weeks leading up to his death, possibly for a fortnight, maybe even since late November. There was a report about a blue Bedford van parked outside the King's Head Social Club on December 3rd. That's only about 175 yards from the Golden Flower, and witnesses said the men inside were acting suspiciously, paying close attention to the delivery driver's comings and goings. Let's be honest, that could have been nothing. But the men in that van were described in a way that matched the 2 seen at the phone box and in the red Fiesta on the night Paul were killed. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Was that a reconnaissance mission? Were they watching Paul and making note of his movements? As the weeks went on, the investigation became clouded by rumours, some of them being particularly cruel. Stories started circulating that Paul had been involved in crimes such as car theft and even drug dealing. His family were understandably devastated by those claims. In February 1994, Paul's case was featured on Crime Watch. That episode aired on the 17th, and the total reward had grown to £15,000, combining the family's offer with money from a northeast-based charity. The segment on the show featuring Paul's case led to a huge response, as it typically does. Lots of calls came in on the back of it. Police did say on the show that Paul had managed to fall out with quite a few people over the years, and many held grudges against him. But none of the new information really led anywhere. Officially at least. Police could never say why Paul was killed because there was never a clear motive. Then came the stories about Tenerife. In March 1994, the Sunday Sun, a regional newspaper in Newcastle, ran an article suggesting Paul had been going back and forth to Tenerife and had been charged with stealing 2 cars before his death. A senior police source was quoted saying he may have been part of a car ringing operation involving stealing cars, changing their chassis and engine numbers, and selling them on across the north of England. But his family said that was absolute nonsense. His sister Dawn said Paul didn't even have a passport. His dad said the same. Paul had never been abroad. Hugh explained that Paul had bought 2 cars from a garage in Newcastle and had the paperwork to prove they were genuine, with him also saying his son had been like a lamb to the slaughter when he went to court over them, believing he'd done nothing wrong. It sounds like Paul had bought 2 cars thinking they were genuine sales when they weren't. They had in fact been stolen, something he didn't realise. 2 officers did go to Tenerife as part of the investigation, but police later confirmed that trip had nothing to do with a car ringing operation. Still, by November 1994, Paul was being publicly linked not just to car theft, but also drug dealing, and had supposed criminal ties abroad. That contradicted earlier comments from D.S. Wilson himself, who said there was no evidence Paul was involved in drugs. Even so, police claimed to have interviewed underworld figures who apparently knew Paul, which only added to his family's confusion and frustration. By that point, over 2,200 people had been interviewed and nearly 1,000 statements taken. But the truth? No one was any closer to finding out who'd killed Paul and why. Then, in September 1995, some vandals did such a scummy thing. They attacked Paul's grave at Black Hill Cemetery, smashing his headstone to pieces in the process. His family were devastated all over again. It's worth noting that on his headstone were the words "murdered by cowards." You can't help but wonder if that message upset someone in the community. Maybe even someone involved. Was it shame, spite, or a warning to stay quiet? Around the second anniversary of his death in December 1995, police said they were looking for someone known only as Mr. X. This man had reportedly been bragging in a pub that he knew who'd killed Paul and that a baseball bat had been used. That would line up perfectly with what the pathologist described as being the murder weapon, a long, round object capable of inflicting the kind of injuries Paul suffered. Was this inside information, or had he simply read about the object's description and come to his own conclusion? Mr. X was apparently already known to police, but they couldn't track him down. Over the years that followed, several arrests were made. In June 1997, 10 men were picked up in dawn raids by armed police on suspicion of Paul's murder. 3 were bailed, 7 were held in custody for longer, but in the end, every single one of them was released without charge. Those raids followed another arrest in April that year, a man in his 30s, who was also released. One of the men arrested early on was a local man called Keith Suddick, a convicted arms dealer. He died in 2012, just before his 50th birthday, when he was found in his flat in Shotley Bridge after taking drugs and drinking alcohol. The coroner ruled it as a death by misadventure. For context, 6 years after Paul's murder, Suddick had actually been jailed for a separate offence, setting fire to Paul's dad Hugh's Astra van outside his house. Suddick admitted possessing explosives and causing an explosion, but what's even more interesting, if you can believe it, is that a police officer, a constable, was also arrested and suspended after that same petrol bomb attack. Suddick said before he died that his life had been ruined because of his link to Paul's murder. He claimed police only treated him as a suspect because he was friends with known Tyneside gangland figures including Viv Graham, who himself was famously gunned down on New Year's Eve 1993 in Wallsend. Like Paul, Graham's murder has never been solved. And that's the strange thing about this case. For all the rumours, arrests and whispers of organised crime, no one has ever been charged with Paul Logan's murder. For his family, Christmas would never be the same again, with them saying the festive season was especially difficult. Elsie once said, "We celebrate for the sake of Paul's children, but I've never put a Christmas decoration up since the day it happened. And I never will again." It's a heartbreaking sentiment that captures just how deeply Paul's death fractured the family's sense of normality. Tragically, both Elsie and Hugh have passed away without ever learning the truth about what happened to their son. Their final years were spent clinging to the hope that one day someone would come forward and do the right thing. By the 10th anniversary of the murder, Detective Superintendent Ian Sharp, who led that inquiry, felt that despite the huge amount of work done, the truth still eluded them. D.S. Sharp told the press that he was keeping an open mind about the motive behind Paul's killing, but believed it was pre-planned and well organised. He added that it was extremely unlikely the killer was acting alone, suggesting that at least 2 people, possibly more, were involved. As the years passed, Paul's family refused to let the case fade into obscurity. In 2017, Dawn made a public appeal, begging those who'd remained silent for nearly a quarter of a century to finally speak up. Have a listen to this.
What would be your message to anyone that knows who killed Paul?
Please come forward with any information that you may have, whether it be little, small. It could seem like nothing to you, but it could make a big difference to the inquiry, just so that we can have a bit of closure as a family.
And how has it been not knowing who killed Paul or why they did it?
It's been extremely difficult. It makes you question who your friends are, what are people talking about, sort of who knows, who doesn't, and basically why aren't people coming forward.
She went on to say, People think time heals all wounds and that we've moved on. We haven't. Our family haven't. And Paul's kids haven't. We live with this every day. We need closure, and we need people to come forward. The smallest detail can be key. A year later, in 2018, former Detective Inspector Dave English, who'd worked on the original investigation, publicly urged anyone with knowledge of the crime to break their silence. That same year, Paul's daughter Natalie turned 25, the same age her dad was when he'd been killed. Her words carried a quiet power. She said, "Someone out there knows why my dad was taken from us. They know I've gone through life without him, and they know what my family has been through. I truly hope we can find the answers we need so my family and I can have our closure." Even now, the case continues to attract attention, and not all of it's welcomed. In 2021, Dawn spoke again about her family's determination not to let rumours and idle gossip tarnish Paul's reputation. He was killed long before the days of social media, she said. But gossip and speculation about what's happened have never really gone away. Over the years, there's been a lot of talk about drugs, debts, or people he might have crossed. You have to learn to take it with a pinch of salt, but it's hard. What people need to remember is that it's somebody's family, somebody's dead brother. Tarnish his memory like that is just not right. It's a sad truth that the rise of armchair detectives has made cases like Paul's even harder for families to endure. While many online sleuths are driven by curiosity or compassion, others spread unverified claims that tend to do more harm than good. They can hinder investigations and reopen old wounds for those left behind. For the Logan family, the pain isn't just that Paul's killers remain free. It's that the truth of who he was continues to be clouded by speculation and half-truths. More than 3 decades have passed since Paul Logan's life was stolen on that cold November night. The 32nd anniversary is just on the horizon. Yet the pain remains as raw as ever for those who loved him. Time may have dulled the shock, but it's never brought the answers his family so desperately need. They say grief never goes away or reduces in size. Rather, your strength and courage grows around it. Paul Logan was a young father with everything to live for. A man who worked hard, loved his children and wife, and was known for his easygoing nature. He wasn't perfect, and his family have never claimed he was, but his flaws make him no less deserving of justice. Whatever the motives behind his murder, nothing can ever justify the brutality of what was done to him. The investigation into Paul's killing remains open, and detectives still believe there are people out there who know what happened that night. People who, for whatever reason, have chosen to stay silent. But silence only serves to protect those responsible. If you, listening to this, have any information, however slight you think it may be, please contact Northumbria Police on 101 or reach out anonymously through Crime Stoppers. Their number is 0800 555 111. For Paul's 2 children, his sister, his brothers, and the generations of family left behind, even the smallest piece of truth could bring an end to more than 30 years of unanswered questions.